Hi, good morning, and welcome to our discussion of Chapter 4, which looks at nonverbal communication. So we talked about verbal communication in the previous chapter, and now we're talking about the other side of communication, which is nonverbal communication. So in section 4.1, it goes over some general principles and functions of nonverbal communication. Some important things that I want you to remember are that nonverbal communication usually convey more meaning than verbal communication, especially in terms of emotions and feelings. We look to nonverbal communication to try to understand what the other person is feeling or sharing in that way. Second is that a lot of times nonverbal communication is more involuntary than verbal communication. So we can control what we say a lot more than we can control how we look. There are people that are very well trained in PR, public relations, they're politicians, and they work very hard to control facial expressions and those things. People who are not well trained in that have a lot of difficulty in controlling those things. So when you get angry, your face may turn red, your eyes may get bigger, you may not be able to control things that your face and body do as much. Third is that nonverbal communication is more ambiguous than verbal communication. So we talked about how verbal communication can be ambiguous and confusing. That is exacerbated with nonverbal communication. So a lot of times we make assumptions based on what we think people are feeling or thinking, and it may be the incorrect assumption at all. And culture strongly influences that. So for example, if we take eye contact in the United States and in most Western cultures, to maintain eye contact shows a sign of respect and shows that you're listening. And so people maintain more eye contact. But in Eastern cultures, a lot of times maintaining eye contact, especially with people who are in a superior position to you, is a sign of disrespect. So they don't do it. So if we're interacting cross culturally, I may be assuming you aren't paying attention when really that isn't the case. So there are some differences there that make nonverbal communication more ambiguous. And then finally, a nonverbal communication is usually more credible than verbal communication. Sorry, that's an error there. But we trust what we see more than what they say. And so if you think about a conversation you've had with a loved one and they tell you they're not upset, but they aren't interacting with you, they aren't looking at you, non-verbally you're picking up that they're mad, you tend to trust the nonverbal message more than the verbal message itself. Nonverbal communication can complement, reinforce, substitute for, or contradict verbal messages. And so there are lots of different ways that it can do that. If I were to say hi and wave at you, I'm using that to complement or reinforce the verbal message. I could also just wave and not say anything to substitute it. Or I could say hi and not look at you at all, which would contradict the message itself. Nonverbal communication regulates our flow and influences others. So if I'm getting ready to leave or I don't want to talk to you, I may take steps back, look at the door, open the door, those sorts of things. And then we use nonverbal communication to establish, maintain, and end relationships. We do that in a variety of ways. We do that with touch and how close we stand to people. And we do that with gestures, with eye contact, with lots of different things. And then we use nonverbal communication to express our identities in a variety of ways. The clothes that we wear express about us. The way we do our hair expresses information about us. If I were wearing jewelry, that would express something about myself. And then also how we decorate and use and work in the space that we're in also communicates information about us. So if you were to go into an office and the office was decked with Dallas Cowboys things, you're going to assume that the person is a Dallas Cowboys fan. Can also help communicate how organized or disorganized someone is. So we communicate our identities in lots of ways nonverbally. Section 4.2 just briefly goes through the different types of nonverbal communication. So kinesics is any study of movement. So for speeches, that means we're looking at head, arm, body, facial, and eye movements. So gestures, how you maintain eye contact with people, how you move throughout the speech. All of those things are in the study of kinesics. Haptics looks at touch, and there's different types of touch that we use in different situations, all the way from functional, professional, down to sexual arousal touch. And they get more intimate as you go down the list. So I might shake hands with somebody at work, but I'm not going to hug them or anything like that. And so there's different types of touch, and how we study touch is really important. There have been a lot of studies that have been done on children that aren't touched and how that affects the way that they interact with people when they're adults. There's some very fascinating information that's there on the study of touch. So next is vocalics, which is the study of paralanguage. So that looks at things like pitch, volume, rate, vocal quality. So how monotone or non-monotone are you? And then verbal fillers. So how many times you say things like or like is the study of vocalics. Proxemics is the study of space and how we use space to communicate nonverbally. Two things that this section of the chapter talked about were proxemic distances. So we have distances that we're comfortable being in. If it's a large group of people we don't know, we have a very large distance. If we're talking to our children or our spouse, the space that we allow them in is much smaller. And then territory, or how we defend our spaces. If you look at siblings that share rooms, oftentimes there's some territory battles that go on there, and that would be involved in the discussion of proxemics. Then there's also the discussion of chronemics, which is time. Three types of time: personal time, physical time, and cultural time. So personal time is how you look at time and evaluate time that's there. Physical time are things that are tied to things like our calendars and holidays and clocks. And then cultural time looks at how do cultures view time. So there are some cultures like the United States that are very monochronic. So we focus on a time. When we say a meeting starts at 5, that means 5 o'clock. But in cultures that are more polychronic, it's, oh, the meeting starts when dinner's over, and there's not a specific time that's there. And then finally, personal presentation and environment is a type of nonverbal communication. So again, what are the things that we wear, communicate about ourselves, and then how we decorate and set up our environment, how does that communicate? So chapter 4.3 and really 4.4 just gives you a handful of helpful tips on how to evaluate how you're encoding and decoding different nonverbal communication, how to become more effective at doing that. And then chapter 4.4 goes into how that differs some depending on the context you're in, if you're in a professional context or an interpersonal context that's there. I just want to highlight a couple of things and then remind you to really review this section in the text for some really practical tips. If there's something you struggle with nonverbally, I would spend some time just looking at that section to see what are some ways that you can help improve your encoding and decoding of those nonverbal messages. In general, some things that you can do to improve nonverbal communication in terms of encoding messages is to be aware of the messages you're sending and receiving. So look at the gestures you use, how you use space and touch and eye contact, and make sure that you're sending messages that you want. Second is to improve your decoding of messages, so how you interpret other people's nonverbal communication. Look for several cues. You don't want to put too much weight just on one cue itself because you might be interpreting that wrong. You want to consider the culture and the context that might be inhibiting or changing that. And then also remember, you want to do some perception checking. So if you think the person looks upset, it's okay to say, are you upset, and try to go from information from there. So that's just a quick overview of chapter 4. Again, nonverbal communication has a lot of study that's been done, lots of research. It can be very fascinating, but I hope you can find a couple of helpful tools that you can help develop your nonverbal communication as we go throughout the class. Thanks, and let me know if you have any questions.